High above the frozen skies of Germany, in December 1943, two planes crossed paths in a moment that defied the very nature of war. One was an American B-17 bomber, battered and bleeding smoke after a brutal mission. The other, a sleek, deadly German Messerschmitt Bf-109, closing in for the kill. But what happened next wasn't destruction, it was mercy. A decision made in seconds, one that would echo across half a century. This is the story of Franz Stigler, the German fighter pilot who had every reason to shoot, but chose not to, and Charlie Brown, the young American bomber pilot who would never forget the man who spared his life. The winter of 1943 was the height of World War II's air war over Europe. The skies were crowded with death, thousands of bombers and fighters clashing daily over cities reduced to rubble. The Allied forces were desperate to cripple Germany's industrial heart. Factories in Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin churned out machines of war, and the only way to stop them was from above. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched another raid. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses roared into the cold air, engines droning like thunder across England's frozen fields. Among them was one plane, B-17F, Ye Olde Pub. Its crew of 10 were young, most barely out of training, led by a 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia named Charlie Brown. It was his first combat mission. The target, Bremen, a city bristling with flak guns, fighter patrols, and danger at every altitude. Brown and his men knew the risks. Many bombers never returned. Still, they climbed into formation, trusting the fortress of aluminum and courage that carried them across the North Sea. The air grew colder. The contrails of the bombers stretched for miles, glinting in the sunlight. But soon, the calm was shattered. German radar picked up the incoming armada, and squadrons of Messerschmitts scrambled to intercept. What followed was chaos, silver bombers and black-crossed fighters locked in a deadly ballet. As the formation approached Bremen, the sky exploded with flak. Black clouds burst around the American planes, shards of metal slicing through wings and fuselages. The Olde Pub was hit almost immediately. A shell tore through the nose, destroying the oxygen system and wounding several men. Another blast shredded the tail. The left engine caught fire. Brown fought the controls, trying to keep the plane level as his crew battled smoke and freezing wind streaming through jagged holes. When they reached the target, they dropped their bombs, but the damage had been done. Lagging behind the main group, Ye Olde Pub became easy prey. German fighters dove in from all directions, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs strafing the crippled bomber. The gunners fired back desperately, but one by one their positions fell silent. Half the crew were wounded. One lay dead. The tail gunner's blood froze on the glass around him. The plane was a wreck, staggering through the sky. Brown's face was slick with blood from a bullet that had grazed his head. His co-pilot slumped beside him, barely conscious. Instruments shattered, engines failing, and hundreds of miles of hostile territory still ahead. By every rule of war, by every law of survival, Ye Olde Pub should have fallen that day. And that's when Franz Stigler saw it. He had just refueled after downing 2 bombers that morning. A seasoned pilot with over 24 victories to his name, Stigler was one of the Luftwaffe's best. But that day, something inside him was different. His commanding officer, the famous ace Gustav Rödel, had once told him, "You shoot a man in a parachute, and I'll shoot you." It was a lesson that stuck with him, that honor could survive even in war. Stigler's Bf-109 streaked toward the wounded bomber. Through his gun sight, he could see the American's tail nearly blown off, its guns hanging limp. He moved in closer, ready to finish the job. But what he saw made him hesitate. The rear turret was still, the side guns unmanned. Inside, he glimpsed the faces of terrified, bleeding young men doing everything they could to keep their dying aircraft aloft. He pulled alongside the bomber, flying wingtip to wingtip. Brown and his crew stared in disbelief. An enemy fighter was flying beside them, close enough to see the pilot's face beneath his goggles. They waited for the burst of cannon fire that would end them, but it never came. Instead, the German pilot nodded. He gestured with his hands, trying to tell them to land. Brown refused. He knew if they landed in German territory, they'd be captured. So the two planes, one enemy, one ally, floated together in a silent understanding over the war-torn countryside. For the next several minutes, they flew side by side. Stigler tried again to signal them toward Sweden, where they could be interned safely. But the B-17 pressed on toward the North Sea. The German ace had a choice: radio ground control and call for flak batteries to finish the job, or guide them safely out of Germany. He made his decision. Franz Stigler dropped his landing gear, a signal to ground gunners not to fire, and escorted the bomber to the edge of the coast. Only when the sea stretched below them did he pull away. Before leaving, he looked once more at the shattered plane, raised his hand in salute, and vanished into the clouds. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew was speechless. No one said a word for a long time. Charlie Brown could hardly comprehend what had just happened. They were alive, because a man who was supposed to kill them had chosen compassion instead. Hours later, the B-17 limped back across the channel, landing broken and bloodied in England. Mechanics counted over 300 bullet holes. 2 engines were dead, the tail nearly gone. It was a miracle the plane had flown at all. When Charlie Brown filed his report, he left one detail out: the German pilot who spared them. Commanders might not believe it, or worse, they might order the man hunted down, so he kept quiet. But he never forgot the face behind that Messerschmitt cockpit, the man who had every reason to destroy them, but didn't. Years passed. The war ended. Men went home, started new lives, raised families. Brown left the Air Force, haunted by that day over Germany. He often wondered what happened to the German pilot, if he'd survived, if he'd ever thought about that moment again. But half a century later, fate would bring them together once more, in a reunion so impossible, it would bring tears to the eyes of everyone who heard it. Years passed, but the memory of that strange encounter in the frozen sky refused to fade. Charlie Brown carried it with him through the rest of the war, through the years of rebuilding that followed, and into the quiet decades of peace. He had seen many terrible things during those years: burning cities, crippled planes, empty seats where friends used to sit. But nothing haunted him quite like that brief moment of mercy. The face of the German pilot, young and solemn behind the glass, lived in his memory like a ghost. In the years after the war, Brown left the military. He tried to move on, working for the State Department, traveling the world. Yet, every Christmas, when snow fell outside his window, he would find his thoughts drifting back to December 1943, to a sky filled with smoke, and to a man who had refused to pull the trigger. For the rest of his life, Brown would tell his family and friends that the only reason he lived was because a German pilot had compassion. But for half a century, that's all it was: a mystery without a name. Somewhere across the Atlantic, that same German pilot lived with his own memories. Franz Stigler survived the war, though his country did not. By 1945, he had flown over 480 combat missions, earning countless decorations. Yet what he remembered most wasn't the kills, it was the one he didn't take. When Germany surrendered, Stigler, like many Luftwaffe pilots, faced a new kind of struggle. His home was gone, his squadron scattered, and the skies he once ruled were silent. He emigrated to Canada after the war, determined to start fresh. There, he built a quiet life, working as a mechanic, trying to leave the past behind. Yet, when he closed his eyes, he could still see that broken B-17 limping across the North Sea, its tail shattered, its crew staring at him in disbelief. He often wondered, did they make it home? For 50 years, both men carried the same memory, unaware that the other was still alive. Then, in 1986, something changed. Brown, now retired and living in Florida, attended a veterans reunion. There, surrounded by men who had flown hundreds of missions over Europe, he finally decided to tell the full story. The German fighter who had spared his crew. When he finished speaking, the room fell silent. One of the men suggested, "Why, don't you try to find him?" At first, Brown thought it was impossible. The war had ended 4 decades ago. Records were incomplete. The German pilot could be anywhere or nowhere. But the idea took root, and soon Brown was writing letters. He reached out to veteran organizations, Luftwaffe archives, even German newspapers. In 1990, a story titled "Looking for the German Pilot Who Spared My Life" was published in a German Fighter Association newsletter. It was a long shot, but across the ocean, in a quiet home in Vancouver, someone was reading that newsletter and froze. It was Franz Stigler. When he read Brown's words, the date, the location, the description of the B-17, he knew instantly. "That was my bomber," he said to himself. "That's the one I didn't shoot down." He wrote a letter to Brown immediately. His message was simple. I was the one. Brown received it weeks later. He opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside, he found the letter and a phone number. For a long time, he just stared at it, unable to believe that after all these years, the man he'd wondered about was real and alive. When he finally picked up the phone and called, a voice answered in a soft German accent. "This is Charlie Brown," he said. "This is Franz Stigler," came the reply. And in that instant, half a century of history melted away. They talked for hours. They shared details of that fateful day, each confirming the other's memories down to the smallest detail. Franz described the bullet holes, the limp tail guns, the wounded men inside. Brown described the Messerschmitt's markings, the EB pilot's gestures, and the moment he saw the German drop his landing gear. There was no doubt left. After 50 years, they had found each other again. In 1991, the two men met face to face for the first time. Not as enemies, but as brothers. When Brown saw Stigler walking toward him, he froze for a moment, overcome with emotion. Then, without a word, they embraced. "My God, it's you," Brown whispered. "It's really you." From that day forward, they became inseparable. They visited each other often, attended air shows together, and even traveled to speak publicly about their story. Not of combat, but of humanity. They would often stand side by side on stage, their arms around each other's shoulders, telling audiences about the day they met over Bremen and the choice that changed both their lives. It was a story that stunned everyone who heard it. Veterans wept. Reporters couldn't believe it. After all the hatred, the destruction, and the loss, here were two men who had found friendship across the divide that once made them enemies. When journalists asked Stigler why he hadn't fired, that day, he gave the same answer every time. They were no longer my enemies. They were human beings, and I couldn't shoot a man in distress. And Brown, he often said, I wouldn't be here without him. He gave me a second chance at life. But beyond their personal story, there were deeper layers, powerful lessons hidden in the details. During the war, the Luftwaffe had a strict code of honor among pilots. It was something that survived even when the rest of the world seemed to lose its morality. Stigler's commanding officer, Gustav Rodel, had drilled it into his men. You are a pilot. not a murderer. That code shaped Franz's decision that day. To him, it wasn't just mercy. It was duty. The duty to remain human in a war designed to destroy humanity. Interestingly, Stigler was just one victory away from receiving Germany's highest military honor, the Knight's Cross. Had he shot down Brown's B-17, he would have earned it. He knew that, but he also knew what it would mean: shooting down a plane that was already beaten. He later said, When Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown finally met in person in 1991, time seemed to stand still. Nearly 50 years of questions, memories, and emotions collided in that single moment. They had both aged, gray hair, weathered faces, hands that trembled slightly from years of labor and loss. But their eyes were the same. The same two men who had once stared at each other across 1,000 feet of empty sky. As they embraced, there were no words for several seconds. Then Charlie pulled back and said quietly, "I never thought I'd see you again." Franz smiled, eyes misted. "I never stopped thinking about you." They spent hours together that first day, seated in Franz's living room in Vancouver, talking as if they were old friends who'd been separated by nothing more than distance. Their wives watched from the side, hardly believing what they were seeing. Two men who should have been sworn enemies were laughing, crying, and finishing each other's memories of a day that defined both of their lives. Brown told Franz how his crew had survived that flight, how they'd patched holes with blankets, how they'd prayed as the engines coughed and sputtered across the North Sea. He showed photos of his family, of his children and grandchildren who existed because of that one act of mercy. Franz looked at them quietly for a long time before saying, "Then I suppose I did something right that day." Their reunion quickly made headlines. Newspapers in both the United States and Germany called it the story that should be impossible. Television crews came to interview them, and audiences around the world were captivated. The idea that two enemies could find friendship, real, genuine friendship, after all that time felt almost unreal. But there they were, side by side, joking about how one had tried to shoot the other down, then saved him instead. What amazed people most was how natural their bond was. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. They called each other brother and meant it. Brown later said that when he met Franz, it was like meeting a part of myself that had been missing. The two began to travel together, telling their story at air shows, schools, and veterans' events. They didn't talk about tactics or victories. They talked about honor, about what it meant to remain human when the world was tearing itself apart. At one event, Brown looked out at a crowd of young cadets and said, "This man was supposed to kill me. Instead, he taught me what it means to be a true warrior." The hall erupted in applause. Whenever they spoke, people noticed something remarkable. They never spoke of hatred, not once. Franz often said that war was fought by men who were told to hate strangers, but most of them, deep down, just wanted to go home. If more men remembered that, he said, maybe fewer would die. In private, the two friends spent quiet afternoons together. They'd sit on porches, drink coffee, and watch the sky. Sometimes Franz would smile and point upward. "That's where we met," he'd say, and Charlie would nod, a little misty-eyed. They often sent each other letters filled with humor and affection. One began, "To my brother in the sky," another ended simply, "Until we meet again, up there." In 2008, time finally caught up with them. Charlie Brown passed away first, at the age of 86. Franz followed just a few months later. Friends who knew them said it felt as though one couldn't live long without the other. In an extraordinary gesture, their families arranged for their ashes to be buried next to each other. An American bomber pilot and a German fighter ace, side by side in peace. Their gravestones face the same direction. And if you stand there quietly, you can almost imagine two planes soaring together again. One limping, one guiding, both bound by something far greater than war. Their story has been told many times since, in documentaries, in books, and in classrooms around the world. But what makes it endure isn't just what happened, it's why it happened. Because in that moment above Germany, Franz Stigler saw not an enemy, but a man, a terrified young pilot doing everything he could to save his crew. And he remembered the words of his commander, "You are a pilot, not a murderer." He had every reason to kill. Instead, he chose to spare. That one decision became a bridge between two lives, two nations, and two generations that had once been sworn to destroy each other. There's a quiet power in stories like this, stories that remind us that even in the darkest times, compassion can survive. That honor isn't defined by victory or medals, but by the choices we make when no one's watching. Brown once said, "The war made us enemies, but our humanity made us friends." And that's the heart of it. The reminder that behind every uniform, every flag, every order, there's a human being capable of kindness. When historians talk about World War II, they often focus on the grand battles, the strategies, the leaders. But sometimes, history is changed not by generals, but by moments of grace between ordinary men. A single act of mercy can ripple outward through time, saving not just a life, but generations of lives that follow. Think about it. If Stigler had pulled the trigger that day, 10 men would have died. Charlie Brown's children would never have been born. The story would have ended in blood and fire, lost among thousands of others. Instead, it became a beacon, a reminder that even in the machinery of war, there's still room for the human heart. In later interviews, both men reflected on how that encounter had shaped their understanding of forgiveness. "We were all just boys," Brown said once. "Boys caught in something much bigger than ourselves. He could have been me. I could have been him." Franz, in turn, said quietly, "I didn't save the bomber. I saved my own soul." Perhaps that's what makes their story so powerful. It doesn't glorify war. It redeems it, even for just a moment. It shows that decency and courage are not opposites, that sometimes true bravery means holding your fire. Today, decades later, their story continues to be shared, told in classrooms, museums, and online videos like this one, because every generation needs to hear it, not as a tale of pilots and planes, but as proof that compassion has no flag and that even in war, humanity can still take flight. So the next time you look up and see a plane crossing the quiet blue sky, remember two men who once met above the clouds, one ready to kill, one ready to die, and how, for a few brief moments, they both became something greater than soldiers, enemies in war, brothers in peace. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, the pilot who spared a bomber and the man who lived to thank him 50 years later.